The sea was calm that morning. In a small village on the English coast, women were already awake before the sun had fully risen. Some were baking bread. Some were milking cows. Some were washing clothes in cold river water. Life was not easy, but it was familiar. The church bell would ring soon. Children would run between houses made of wood and stone. Fishermen would push their boats into the water. No one knew that before the day ended. Everything would change. Far out on the horizon, dark shapes appeared. At first, they looked like birds resting on the sea. Then someone saw the dragon heads. Long, narrow ships moved quickly toward the shore. Their sails were striped red and white. Shields lined their sides like a wall of painted circles. The Vikings had arrived. There was no warning horn loud enough. No wall strong enough. No time to gather all the people. The attack was fast and violent. Men tried to defend their homes with simple weapons, but Viking warriors were trained fighters. They moved with discipline and strength. Houses were set on fire. Smoke filled the sky. Cries filled the air. Women grabbed their children and tried to run. Some hid in fields. Some fled toward the church. Some prayed. But the Vikings were not only looking for gold, they were looking for people. Slavery was a central part of Viking economy. Captives were valuable. Strong men could be sold for labor. Skilled craftsmen could be traded. And young women were especially desired in slave markets across the Norse world. Within hours, the village was silent again. But it was not the peaceful silence of mourning. It was the silence of loss. Many men were dead. Many homes were ashes, and dozens of women were tied together with ropes. Their hands were bound. Their future was no longer theirs. They were forced toward the Longships. Some screamed. Some fought. Some stood in shock, unable to understand what was happening. Children cried for mothers who were already being dragged away. Families were separated without mercy. The Vikings worked quickly. They knew English kings might send soldiers if news spread too fast. By sunset, the ships were already pushing back into the sea. From the shore, smoke rose from what was once a living village. On the ships, fear replaced hope. The North Sea was cold and unforgiving. Waves hit the wooden sides hard. The captives were kept low in the boat, guarded by armed warriors. Food was limited. Water was shared carefully. Many women had never left their village before. Now they were crossing open ocean toward lands they had only heard about in stories. The journey could take days. Some ships sailed to Scandinavia. Others stopped in Ireland, especially in Dublin, which had become one of the largest Viking slave markets in Europe. Dublin was not only a settlement, it was a trading center. Silver from the east, furs from the north, and slaves from Britain were all bought and sold there. When the ships arrived, the captives were taken off and grouped together. This was not the end of their fear. It was the beginning of a new kind. The market was loud. Traders shouted prices. Buyers inspected people like animals. Strength, age, health, everything was examined. The women stood in rows. Some tried to stay strong. Some lowered their eyes. Some cried quietly. They did not understand the Norse language spoken around them. They only understood one thing. They were no longer free. Slavery in the Viking world was called Thrall status. A thrall had no legal rights. They belonged to their owner. Some women were bought to work in farms and homes. They would cook, clean, grind grain, and care for animals. Others were taken further north to Iceland or Norway. Some were sold again in distant markets. Their names were often changed. Their language slowly faded if no one around them spoke it. Identity began to disappear. But even in this darkness, the human spirit fought to survive. Some women learned the Norse language quickly. They adapted. They became skilled workers in their new households. Some gained small trust from their masters. In Radekasis, a thrall could earn or be granted freedom after many years. Freedom was not common, but it was possible. Faith became a quiet comfort for many English women. Christianity was strong in England, while Vikings at that time followed Norse gods like Odin and Thor. The clash of religion was painful. Some women kept their prayers silent, whispered at night. Over time, something unexpected began to happen in Viking lands. Christianity slowly spread north, and historians believe enslaved women from Britain may have played a role in that change. Through quiet teaching, through raising children, through influence inside households. Even in chains, influence can survive. Archaeologists today have found graves in Viking regions with women who appeared to have been from the British Isles. Isotope testing of bones shows they grew up in different lands before being buried in Scandinavia. This proves their journeys were real. Their suffering was real. But so was their impact. Not every story ended in total darkness. Some women married into Norse families. Some became mothers of children who grew up between two cultures. History often records kings and warriors, but it forgets the women taken across the sea. Yet without them, Viking society would not have grown as it did. Their labor strengthened farms, their presence shaped culture, their endurance shaped generations. The slave markets eventually declined as Viking raids slowed and kingdoms became more stable. But for many women taken during those early centuries, the damage was already done. They never saw their homeland again. They never walked the same village paths. They never heard the same church bells. The first winter in the north was the hardest. For many English women taken across the sea, cold was not new. England had cold seasons too. But Scandinavia was different. The wind felt sharper. The nights felt longer. Snow covered the ground for weeks. Inside long wooden houses, life followed a strict rhythm. Thralls woke before everyone else. They fed animals. They carried water. They chopped wood. They prepared food before the household leaders rose from their beds. There was no rest day. Work was constant. A Viking farm was not small. It required strong labor to survive winter. Animals had to be protected. Grain had to be stored. Clothing had to be woven. Women worked at looms for hours, weaving wool into cloth. They ground grain into flour with heavy stones. Their hands became rough. Their backs ached, but pain became normal. What hurt more was memory. In quiet moments, some women remembered the sound of English church bells. They remembered green hills. They remembered mothers, sisters, daughters. They wondered if anyone still searched for them. They wondered if anyone still spoke their name. In the Viking world, a thrall had no voice in law. They could not testify in court. They could not own property, but they were not always treated the same way. Some masters were cruel. Some were practical. Some were strict, but not violent. It depended on the household. Over time, many English women began to understand the Norse language. They listened carefully. They learned quickly. Survival required it. Language became protection. If you understand what people say around you, you can avoid danger. Some women formed quiet friendships with other thralls. They shared stories and whispers. They reminded each other of who they once were. Identity is powerful. Even when chains are invisible, memory keeps the past alive. In some households, enslaved women raised children, not their own, but the children of their masters. They fed them, cleaned them, carried them. Children often grow close to the women who care for them. Through this closeness, something important happened. Culture slowly blended. English songs were hummed quietly while rocking babies to sleep. Christian prayers were whispered into small ears. Stories from England traveled north through memory. Historians believe that enslaved women from Britain helped spread Christianity into Scandinavian lands long before official conversions. It was not done through power. It was done through patience, through everyday life. This quiet influence changed history more than many battles. Some thralls eventually gained freedom. It did not happen often, but it happened. A master might grant freedom after many years of loyal service. Sometimes a thrall could buy freedom if allowed to keep small earnings. A freed woman was no longer property. But freedom did not mean return. Most had no way to go back to England. The sea that brought them north remained a barrier, so they built new lives. They married. They became part of Norse communities. Their children grew up speaking Old Norse, not Old English, but inside them lived two worlds. Archaeologists today have found Viking graves containing women buried with traditional Norse items. Yet their bone chemistry shows they were born in the British Isles. This means they did not remain outsiders forever. They became part of the Viking world. But the cost of that transformation was heavy. For every woman who adapted, there were others who struggled deeply. Some never learned the language well. Some never stopped grieving. Some carried quiet sadness all their lives. Slavery is not only physical control. It is emotional separation. It is living without choice. The Viking slave trade was large and organized. Raids in England, Ireland, Scotland, and even France brought thousands of captives north. Dublin became one of the biggest slave markets in Europe during the 9th and 10th centuries. From Dublin, captives could be sold again to traders from Scandinavia or even to distant lands in the Middle East through long trade routes. This was not random violence. It was business. Silver coins from the Islamic world have been found in Viking graves. That silver often came through trade networks where slaves were exchanged. The economy of the Viking world depended partly on human lives. It is hard to imagine today. But in that time, slavery was common across many societies. Not only in the Viking world, but also in Anglo-Saxon England, in the Frankish kingdoms, and even in parts of the Mediterranean. This does not excuse it, but it reminds us that cruelty was not limited to one people. Still, for the English women captured in coastal raids, this truth gave little comfort. Har spast. Some Viking settlements grew into cities. Some raiders became farmers permanently. Over time, Vikings settled in parts of England too, in areas later known as the Danelaw. History is complex. In some strange twists of fate, descendants of enslaved English women may have later lived in Viking communities established back in England itself. Bloodlines mixed, cultures blended, but trauma does not disappear easily. Stories were passed down quietly through generations, grandmothers telling children about lands across the sea, about villages burned, about journeys in longships. Memory became resistance. Even if names were forgotten, emotions survived. Centuries later, when Viking raids ended and Christianity spread across Scandinavia, the slave trade slowly declined. Laws changed. Social systems evolved, but archaeology continues to uncover the evidence. Chains have been found. Slave collars have been discovered in some areas of Europe. Mass graves show violent raids. An isotope analysis of skeletons proves that many women buried in Viking lands were not born there. They had crossed the sea unwillingly. Today, historians try to give voice to those who never wrote their own stories. We do not know their exact words. We do not know their exact thoughts, but we know their journeys were real. The horrifying fate of English women in Viking slave markets was not only about physical suffering, it was about losing home. It was about losing name. It was about waking each day in a land where everything felt foreign. And yet, within that darkness, many survived. Survival is not always loud. It is not always heroic in the way stories describe. Sometimes survival is simply breathing one more day, learning one more word, holding one small memory close to the heart. When we speak of Vikings today, we often picture warriors with axes and ships with dragon heads. But behind those images are quieter stories. Stories of women taken from English shores. Stories of markets in Dublin filled with human lives for sale. Stories of cold northern winters where foreign voices slowly blended into Norse speech. History remembers the raiders, but we must also remember the taken. Because without them, the story is incomplete. And perhaps the most important lesson is this. Even in the harshest systems, even in the darkest chapters, the human spirit does not disappear. It bends. It adapts. It survives. And sometimes, through survival alone, it changes the world in ways no conqueror ever expected. Time moved forward, even for those who did not want it to. Years passed in silence. The young English women taken in raids slowly became older women in Norse lands. Their hair changed. Their hands became marked by labor. Their voices carried accents, shaped by two cultures. Some had children who never knew England. Some carried memories so painful they rarely spoke of them. But memory does not need to be spoken loudly to survive. It lives in habits, in the way bread is baked, in lullabies sung softly at night, in the quiet sign of the cross, made before sleep. Over time, Viking society itself began to change. Raiding became less common as kingdoms grew stronger and defended their coasts better. Trade replaced violence in many areas. Scandinavian rulers converted to Christianity. The world that had once captured and sold English women slowly transformed into something different. But transformation does not erase the past. In Old Norse law codes, there were still rules about thralls. There were still social lines separating free people from those who had once been owned. Even freed women carried the mark of their origin. Yet some found ways to rise quietly. A freed woman who married a free Norseman could become part of the community. Her children could grow into respected members of society. Over generations, the line between captive and native bloodlines mixed across the North Sea. Modern DNA studies show strong connections between populations in England, Ireland, and Scandinavia. This is not only because Vikings invaded England, it is also because thousands of English women were taken north. Their presence shaped the future of entire regions. Archaeologists have uncovered graves in Iceland and Norway containing women buried with Norse jewelry and tools. Yet scientific testing shows they were born in Britain. This tells us something important. They were not always kept separate. They became woven into Viking society itself. The horrifying fate that began in fire and chains did not end only in darkness. It ended in survival. But survival does not cancel suffering. Imagine standing on the shore of England as a young woman, watching dragon-headed ships appear from the mist. Imagine the fear. Imagine the confusion. Imagine being pulled away from everything familiar. Then imagine surviving long enough to see your grandchildren play in a land that once felt like a prison. History is rarely simple. The Vikings were not monsters in every moment. They were farmers, traders, parents, and explorers, but they were also raiders. And for the English women taken in slave markets, that reality shaped every day of their lives. When we talk about the Viking Age, we often celebrate exploration, ships reaching Iceland, Greenland, even North America. But behind exploration was labor. Behind settlement was slavery. Behind wealth was human cost. Dublin became one of the largest slave trading centers in Europe during the 9th century. Captives were sold not only to Scandinavia, but also into wider European and Middle Eastern markets through complex trade networks. This was part of a global system long before the modern world. Human lives were currency. And yet, in that system, something unexpected happened. Cultural exchange, language mixed, religions blended, stories crossed seas. English women brought skills in farming, weaving, cooking, and faith traditions that slowly influenced Norse households. Some historians argue that, without these captives, Viking settlements would have struggled to grow as quickly as they did. The women who were taken unwillingly helped build the very societies that captured them. This is the cruel irony of history. Powerful men wrote laws. Warriors won battles, but quiet labor sustained nations. Today, when tourists visit Scandinavian museums, they see swords, helmets, and ships. But increasingly, museums also display shackles, slave collars, and evidence of thrall life. Modern history no longer hides this chapter, because understanding the Viking world means understanding all of it. The bravery and the brutality. The horrifying fate of English women in Viking slave markets reminds us of something deeper. Civilizations rise not only through glory, but also through suffering. And often, the people who suffer most are those whose names are never recorded. We do not know the names of most of these women. We do not know their exact stories. But we know they existed. We know their bones lie in foreign soil. We know their DNA flows in millions of people today. That means their lives mattered, even if history tried to forget them. The sea that once carried them away still moves between England and Scandinavia. Waves rise and fall, just as they did 1,000 years ago. But now, those waters connect nations peacefully. Ships cross for trade, travel, and friendship, not raids. The world changed. And perhaps one of the greatest forms of justice is memory. By telling their story, we give back something that was taken. Recognition. When we remember the English women captured in Viking raids, we do not remember them only as victims. We remember them as survivors, as cultural bridges, as mothers of generations, as silent forces who shaped history from within the shadows. The Viking Age was filled with fire and steel, but it was also filled with quiet endurance. And sometimes, the strongest legacy is not the sword that conquers. It is the spirit that refuses to disappear. The dragon ships are gone. The slave markets are silent. The longhouses have turned to ruins. But the story remains, and as long as we continue to tell it, the women who once stood in those markets will never be completely forgotten. History remembers the conquerors, but humanity remembers. They endured, and that is where their true strength lives forever.